LeBron James and the Miami Heat taught the NBA to secretly build super teams. The Warriors taught the NBA to shoot more threes. The Spurs made beautiful basketball cool again. And the 76ers proved tanking could get 1, maybe 2 stars. The Phoenix Suns now made a surprising run to the NBA Finals, and we're wondering what, if anything, the NBA can learn from James Jones and the Phoenix Suns. All right, Sam, even though the Suns were the 2nd seed overall in the entire NBA, and they had the best record against teams over 500, for some reason, their run was still a surprise to many NBA fans and even analysts in the NBA. And as we were talking about, or as I was talking about, people are going to learn something from this team. I have some thoughts on what I think that other teams are going to learn from the Suns. What do you think is going to be the thing that people learn from the Suns?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different directions you could go with this, Mike, but I was trying to think of analysis that was better than just the Suns acquired good players. Because at the baseline, obviously that's what it is. Obviously that's what any contending team does. You acquire Chris Paul, you acquire Jay Crowder. But you look deeper, I put out that video last week about the identity of this Suns team being their playmaking. I think similar to the beautiful game Spurs that we saw about a decade ago now, that really is close to pinpointing the identity of the Suns. They had an amazing assist turnover ratio in the regular season that has held steady in the playoffs. And it's not just Chris Paul. It's about stacking role players who make smart decisions with the basketball in their hands. So that continues to be very important. But from James Jones's perspective, I think more so than any one thing that you can talk about with the Suns and what they did this year specifically, James Jones had a really precise idea, a really smart idea of being able to balance multiple modern modes of thought together on this team. And it's a very difficult thing to do, to balance these things. But a couple things specifically that I think he nailed is A, bring together multiple dynamic ball handlers who are 3-level scorers in Chris Paul and Devin Booker. That has been just so central to what the Suns' offensive identity has been all season. And we've seen very good teams. Take the Dallas Mavericks, for instance. Luka Doncic, phenomenal player. But I think the playoffs is just showing us that you need more than one guy. You need more than one guy to be able to initiate your sets, and the Suns have that. But then the second part of it is team them up with the right role players, the 3-and-D switchable wings. The entire league has been going crazy for these types of players, the Jay Crowders, the Mikal Bridges, for years now, but you need them in tandem with the offensive initiators. You look at a team like Portland, they've got the two guys together, arguably, in Dame and CJ, arguably, but they don't have the defense. It's like that could be a much better team if they had a Jay Crowder, a Mikal Bridges. So James Jones has landed the right role players, and then, of course, DeAndre Ayton, and he's fit it together in a way that it presents a real alchemy, and it's just coalesced very nicely.
Yeah, when I think about what other teams are going to try to learn from the Suns, I think that they're probably going to try to learn more from the process than the results necessarily. And I think the Suns, sort of the way the team came together, was this mixture of the process, if you will, like the process Sixers idea of multiple shots at high draft picks, which didn't always work out for the Suns, but one of them did, in DeAndre Ayton, and then, of course, Mikal Bridges in the top 10 as well, a lottery pick at the very least. And I think the lesson learned, I think, at the end of that, once James Jones took over, is not being afraid to make dramatic moves. And I think that Chris Paul was the obvious one there. In a lot of ways, this is kind of what happened with the 76ers. It's just that Jimmy Butler didn't want to play there anymore, right? They went through the process. They got multiple really good players, and then they made that right move with the assets that they acquired over time for Jimmy Butler, and it worked well for them when he was on the team. If he stayed on the team, imagine that team this year with Jimmy Butler. Yeah. That likely would be a title team. They could have probably steamrolled the East if he was fully healthy. But I think for the Suns, they found the right group. And look, always with teams that make it to the NBA Finals, luck is involved. And one of the things that the Suns lucked out in is Chris Paul being available and still being able to play. It's rare that a player of his caliber would still be available at his age. So, in a way, I think teams will probably learn from tanking still kind of works sometimes. We're seeing OKC do it. Obviously, the odds are a little different than they used to be, but also not being too precious with your assets once you have good players on your team. And trying to find the right moves once you have it.
And I think that's key to understanding what differentiates, because you're right, the Suns don't directly contrast the process. There are elements of that in there. They had a number one pick in DeAndre Ayton, but there are elements to what James Jones is doing that stand out very, very sharply in contrast to the previous regime under Ryan McDonough. And to that point, Mike, I'll turn it back on you. Over the past couple of years, we've seen so many of these moves from James Jones met with this resistance from analysts, from online communities, which all obviously looks kind of stupid now. Why do you think that was, and what do you think we learned from that?
Well, I think it's pretty simple to me in that a lot of analysts look at bad teams and they say they should just be bad until they draft a bunch of players and then they're going to be good. There's no middle ground of that for the Suns, and I think the time that James Jones was met with the most criticism is signing Ricky Rubio. That was probably the time where we saw articles that said the Suns improved, but to what end, right? That's a famous one. And another one that said, are the Suns even better than last year? That was another one, right? The year they won 19 games, the question was, are they even better the next year with Ricky Rubio? And I think the importance of not being afraid to improve marginally. Maybe you don't immediately get into the playoffs. Arguably, maybe they could have if DeAndre Ayton was not suspended for as long as he was. But not being afraid to improve marginally and show the rest of the league how good these players can be. And also, I think from James Jones's perspective, find out what they are when they have a proper point guard and proper guys around them, and do the proper thing with that and make the moves depending on what you learned from there being an actual point guard on the team. So I think that part of it is they either say either you're a contender or you should be tanking, and that's lazy analysis. They're not really looking deep into it. They're not realizing that Devin Booker never really played with a point guard that wanted to be on the Phoenix Suns. And laziness, I guess, is the best way to put it. I mean, do you agree with that?
It's a lot of it. I absolutely agree that it's a lot of it, but also I think this overemphasis on asset management that we see so much online is a failure to understand the human element of basketball, and I think that's one of the critical things you have to talk about of what you can learn about James Jones's regime, not to mention the reason why Ryan McDonough has failed in the first place, is gathering up too many players. This is what McDonough did, with chips on their shoulders or in the wrong roles, and just not properly optimizing them, not properly talking to them in the first place like human beings in a way that it blew up in his face year after year. James Jones hasn't been afraid to make the difficult decisions. He hasn't been afraid to trade TJ Warren for cash and make, what looks like from an asset perspective a step back, only to take 2 steps forward. Sometimes it's okay to do that. Sometimes it's okay to go against the conventional thought of just dealing with raw assets. Sometimes it's okay, you look at the draft, to take the older player who is going to be more NBA ready on a cheap contract while he's still on his rookie scale deal. James Jones has had conviction throughout this entire process, and I think it's just been a very balanced approach from him of understanding. Yes, he understands what the analytics are. The Suns have their analytics department that tells them about certain players, but it doesn't rule the entire thing. And there's very much a focus on the human element of basketball. You can see it from James Jones. You can see it from Monty Williams too. And it's very obvious why they brought in Monty to be the coach of this team for that reason too.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think one of the things that's interesting to talk about at this point, right? The Suns are where they are due to the situation that they found themselves in, right? Finding Chris Paul at the right time, finding the right players that work well together. I think the Suns will rightfully be criticized for not taking Luka Doncic, but it did work out, right? DeAndre Ayton and Devin Booker play well together. They work well as teammates. So the question is, how repeatable is this for other teams? Can other teams look at what the Suns did and try to repeat it? Maybe not even necessarily the process that it took to build the team, even how they play, which includes 2 of the best mid-range scorers in the NBA, something that people don't even consider when team building in a lot of ways. What do you think?
Look, Chris Paul is a once-in-a-generation type talent with the way he leads a team. It's naive to think that there's always going to be a Chris Paul figure just looming out there on the trade market. But generally speaking, I think what we can say is if you're a middling team and you have the chance to be bold and go out there, I mean, what the Suns are proving this year is that they were a team that wasn't given much of a shot. And then, we can be honest, a couple of injuries happened here or there. It doesn't matter as long as you make it to the finals, as long as you give yourself that chance. Zach Lowe says all the time, Daryl Morey has said this in the past, if you have even a 5% chance of winning the chip, you go for it. because then someone's hamstring gives out, someone's knee gives out, or you just coalesce in kind of this magical run in the playoffs with great chemistry, and suddenly you're right there. That's happening to the Suns this year. And I think if you're a fan of a middling team, don't be afraid to be bold. Don't be afraid to trade for a guy who maybe is a little bit over the hump, or for some reason is perceived to be a negative asset, as Chris Paul was just a couple of years ago. As long as you're not giving up the core pieces, the core young pieces that are going to make up your team for years to come. And then the second part of that is, if you're a fan of a bad team right now, not even a middling team like the Suns were last year, but a straight up bad team, there should be some hope here. You never know where you can be in 2 years. In just 2 years' time, the Suns are showing that. That's not to say that any team right now that is coming off a 20-win season is going to be contending in 2 years. But if you make the right string of moves, you could be right there too.
I think the hardest thing to say is replicable from what the Suns did is picking Devin Booker 13th. That's the craziest part. For all of the tanking that the Suns did, right, that ended with Josh Jackson, Dragan Bender, Marquise Chris, and guys like that, the best player that they got throughout that entire time was after they won 48 games and missed the playoffs, right? The most wins ever for a team that missed the playoffs. They ended up drafting Devin Booker after that. And that's just that's a lucky break, and that's the kind of luck that it takes sometimes. And I think that's the one thing that you can't really say is a guaranteed thing to replicate. That does happen.
Absolutely.
Good players are drafted later in the lottery relatively often, but the higher likelihood is that you're going to get a star higher in the draft. So sometimes maybe you don't fret too much if you're picking 13th. You could end up with a guy like Devin Booker, a guy like Kobe Bryant, for example. Maybe Donovan Mitchell, who was picked later in the lottery as well. These are players that can become stars that are picked later in the lottery, but there's no guarantee with that, and that's the hardest thing.
You just never know. Speaking from experience, if there are any non-Suns fans out there who are fans of bad teams right now, I know from the past several years, you spend entire seasons driving yourself crazy with ping pong balls, and then you never know exactly how it's going to turn out. Yeah. I thought Dragan Bender, I thought Marquise Chris, I thought Josh Jackson were great picks at the time.
Alex Len.
Alex Len. I didn't necessarily think much of Devin Booker outside of being a spot-up shooter when the Suns first drafted him. 5 years later, look where we are.
Yeah. Yep.
You just don't know.
That's right. I think the biggest lesson to learn is that if there is a GM available whose nickname is Champ, you should probably hire him. That's probably a guy who understands how to make it to the NBA Finals. We would love to hear what you guys think NBA teams can learn from this Phoenix Suns run. Make sure to drop it in the comments. If you'd like to hear more Phoenix Suns analysis, check out our podcast, The Timeline of Phoenix Suns Podcast.